Well, good morning. Buenos dias a todos y todas. We're celebrating Martin of Tours, which is a city in France. Martin was born around the year 330 in what is now Hungary, and he grew up in Italy. He was drafted into the Roman army when he was 15, and he soldiered across much of Europe. He spent years as a catechumen. That means somebody preparing to be baptized. But he wasn't yet ready to take his vows. While there was debate in the early church about whether Jesus' followers could serve in the military, it's abundantly clear that Roman soldiers brought Christian practice to the British Isles as early as the 2nd century. The idea that fellow Christians would support you, bury your body, and help to care for your family if you were killed brought many into the community. Veterans continue to be leaders in this church. Perhaps the most famous story told about Martin involves an encounter with a poor and underclothed man outside the city walls of Amiens in the cold of winter. Martin was in full gear, including weapons and battle cloak. When he saw the man begging for help, he took off his cloak, took out his sword, cut it in half. He gave half to the cold man, and he put back on the half that he had left. Apparently, bystanders mocked him. But the encounter led him to be baptized and then to leave the army before too much longer, by the time he was about 20. In the coming years, Martin established a monastic community that was inspired by what he had learned from the desert fathers and mothers in Egypt. They were solitary individuals living spare and ascetic lives who gathered regularly for meals and worship and spent much of their time in prayer. Martin lived in a community like this for years, during which the local bishop Hilary, it means happy, ordained him a priest. When Martin was in his early 40s, the people of Tours elected him bishop, and he accepted only on the condition that he could continue his monastic and ascetic life. Apparently, a number of his episcopal colleagues found him quite difficult. For he did not support their harsh treatment of heretics or their more comfortable lifestyles. His developing monastic community was visited by Celtic Christians who took those practices back to Ireland and Scotland. Among them were St. Ninian and probably St. Patrick. His influence on the Anglican tradition is considerable, and I think more churches are named after him in England than anybody else, including the oldest church in Canterbury. Martin's cloak, or perhaps a fragment of it, was preserved in the small prayer chapel in Tours, and it gave us that word chapel. It's from the Latin capella, which means a little cloak. Martin died simply, as he had lived, in the year 397. So what does Martin have to teach us today? His living witness of sharing probably seems the most significant. His monastic community shared their lives and held their goods in common and distributed them as people had need. We read about that same reality in the book of Acts in very early Christian communities. It is a radical way of living that has continually emerged to challenge Jesus' followers through the ages. Some of you may have seen a provocative news article a week ago It's in the New York Times, and it's titled, "Are Christians Supposed to Be Communists?" The author notes that continued struggle between ideas of private property and the shared garden of creation that we have been given to steward. At a time in history when wealth is increasingly concentrated in fewer and fewer hands and income equality continues to grow, it's a very important conversation. It's too big a conversation for this moment, but I will encourage you to take it home and take it to heart and start a conversation where you are. As your congregations develop their habits of year-round stewardship and engaging the neighborhoods in which we live and move and have our being, keep wrestling with how we love our neighbors as we love ourselves. I want to point to a specific character of Martin's cloak sharing that might offer a window on that larger question. The man who was freezing outside the city gates had been bypassed by throngs of people, many of whom had lots of extra clothes that they might have given him. Martin comes by, and all he has is his battle gear. Yet in the tradition of all good scouts, he improvises. He's got a cloak. Maybe he can solve the problem by giving part to the beggar and keeping part for himself. His sacrifice is not giving away everything. His act makes holy both the gift he gives the neighbor and the peace he keeps for himself. Both human beings are cared for. He has loved his neighbor as himself. Most of us here have way more than enough for our daily needs. And we live in communities where there are significant numbers of people without adequate housing or meaningful employment, or who live in what we euphemistically call food insecurity. It's chronic hunger. Many people live without adequate health care, particularly without access to mental health care, to emotional and spiritual resources. Belonging to a meaningful human community can answer almost all of those challenges. That's what Paul means when he says, bear one another's burdens. Even if a community is suffering widespread flood or fires in the ways that we've seen this fall, the solidarity within that community and partners from outside the immediate crisis make an enormous difference. When we're all in this together, the dynamic shifts in miraculous ways. 5,000 people on a hillside get fed in Galilee. A cold man finds shelter from the storm. Solidarity in the midst of need and grief eases the burden, and it gives hope when all seems lost. Sharing yourself with a neighbor in need, your words, your embrace, your presence, offers hope and a measure of healing. As a nation, we seem to live in chronic grief in the face of wanton violence and disregard for the preciousness of human life. We live in a Martin moment. We can walk by the suffering, ignore the bloodied bodies, and despair of change because the problems seem too big and too complicated. Or we can offer a part of what we have for the healing and the greater good of the whole community. Some of us here are gray enough to remember the oil crisis of the early 1970s. For those of you who weren't here, you may have read about it. Oil prices skyrocketed. Gasoline shortages were chronic. People waited in hours-long lines to fill their gas tanks. As a nation, we responded by lowering highway speed limits. We started to carpool. In some places, we restricted fuel purchases to every other day, and we began to legislate better fuel economy. We all limited our appetites in some way so that we all might be able to drive to work and to go visit family and to buy groceries. Motor vehicle fatality rates went down along with the gas lines. In an era when death by gun takes almost as many lives as motor vehicles or overdoses, we need a similar strategy. Only a tiny fraction of those gun deaths, 1 or 2%, are the mass shootings that get media attention. 2/3 of gun deaths are suicides. The rest are murders. More than half of all suicides involve a gun. We need to love our neighbors as much as we love ourselves. We need to bear one another's burdens. Some of our responses might look like a sacrifice to some, yet the consequences will be a blessing to all. We can find ways to remove weapons of war from the public square. We can find ways, more effective ways, to make guns less readily available to those who contemplate violence against self or other. And we can find ways to build emotional resilience and healing into communities that might redirect the lonely and despairing. How many innocent children need to die before we act? How many suicides and murders will we ignore before we begin to offer a gift into the midst of the carnage? It has long been said that the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is that good people do nothing. The gospel assures us that the actions of a few for good can and will ultimately prevail. Will you share your cloak? Will you reach out and love your neighbor as yourself?